Tonight we continue our lecture series with the topic, the presentation called The Method Confirmed. The chief character in terms of Millerites in this one is Josiah Litch. He was born in 1809 and he lived through till 1886. Josiah Litch was a preacher, belonged to the Methodist Episcopal Church up in New England. And according to his biographical entry on Wikipedia, he is best known for his connections with the Millerite movement and for using Bible prophecy to predict a loss of power for the Ottoman Empire. And that's what we want to see here. How did that actually come to be? So in order to understand that, we need to go into I believe it's the third vision of John in Revelation. And that's the seven trumpets. So the seven trumpets, John's third vision, it's from Revelation chapter 8, verse 2. And by the way, there's at least a couple of times in Revelation where the chapter divisions don't quite make sense. And this is one. Verse 1 actually belongs to the prior vision. And so this vision begins in verse 2. So just a small note there. Goes all the way to the end of chapter 11. Now, trumpets are a symbol of war, and so the seven trumpets detail the wars that desolate Rome and its successors, and goes all the way, and it's quite a dramatic conclusion in the seventh trumpet. But we're concerned mainly with trumpets, the first, 5, 6 trumpets. So, a few comments on here. Uriah Smith says that in the seals we have had the history of the church during what is called the gospel dispensation. In the seven trumpets now introduced, we have the principal political and warlike events which were to transpire during the same time. So the prior vision is the seals, and it's a look through history, but it's a different look through history. You know how Daniel's visions, starting with the dream of the king, and then 7 and 8, kind of goes back through the same story of history. So Revelation kind of does that, but takes some different views. Now, sources for the trumpets, this will be in your teacher resource notes, which I'm endeavoring to finish in the next few days. There will be a few sources quoted. Historic source would be Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. There are something like 12 volumes. I found those and downloaded them. You can find them on archive.org. I will actually be putting those on USB for us, so that's going to be really good. As far as interpreters, you have Uriah Smith and Stephen Haskell and other Adventist pioneers as well, but those are two main ones that I have referred to. Smith is very detailed. Haskell is gives more summary, and both are useful. If you're trying to, so in the lecture notes here, you're trying to paste in something that's more of a summary. Haskell tends to do a better job at that, but Smith gives more details when you really want to know what a certain thing means. So I've got a smattering of all through here, and I think, so my notes on the seven trumpets are going to end up being about 13 to 15 pages. So that's coming along really nicely, nearly finished. Then let's say Millerite source is Josiah Litch, we just talked about a moment ago, and a man called Alexander Keith, who was another preacher who was a Protestant, and he wrote a book called The Signs of the Times, published in the 1820s. So just a note on this, as far as interpretation of the seven trumpets, it's interesting that the basic outline of what the seven trumpets are, at least the first 4 or 5, is actually laid out well before the Millerite movement. So Keith was one who laid out that understanding of the trumpets being the various attacks on the Roman Empire that led to its demise. And they kept chopping pieces of it off and hassling what's left of the Roman Empire. And they go through quite a thorough outline of all of this history. Now, it's interesting that Keith quotes Gibbon, the historian, historian Gibbon, his book, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Now, Gibbon was not a believer. He was not a Christian. He was just a historian. And so Keith says that all you need to do is put a bit of introductory, passages, tack the verses on there, delete a few unholy words, and Gibbon is an expositor of the seven trumpets. So Keith quotes historian Gibbon extensively, extensive quotes from Gibbon. Now, Smith and Josiah Litch and others like that, they quote Keith extensively. So what I found was, I'm reading Smith, and Smith is quoting entire large passages of Keith on the seven trumpets. And I go to Keith, and he's quoting large passages of Gibbon. So as I'm prepared the notes, I've actually separated them out many times. And I've gone and downloaded Gibbon's Decline and Fall and Keith's Signs of the Times. And I've, checked across them, sometimes changed how much I'm quoting, add a little bit more, and so been able to go back to those sources, which I'm providing to you as well. So that's very interesting. So it's, I suppose the idea here is that the Millerites didn't invent this outline here. However, they did extend it. They did look more into it, especially when we come to that one which we'll look at finally. But first, let's go to trumpets 1 to 4 just briefly. In Revelation chapter 8, verse 7, after some introduction, he finally gets to the angels with the trumpets coming and blowing their trumpets. And verse 7 says, "The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up." And you look at that and you go, what is that talking about? The word picture here describes the invasions of the Goths upon the empire, and the destruction they inflicted is well described by the terms hail, fire, and blood. The wasting of the land is aptly described in the loss of the green grass and a third of the trees. And the language of Gibbon actually talks about this, and Keith points that out, and Smith quotes him, and you find all that. However, I give you only little bits here of the first four just to whet your appetite, and you'll have to go and look into that a little bit more. Second trumpet is verses 8 and 9. "The second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed." Smith says the history illustrative of the sounding of the second trumpet evidently relates to the invasion and conquest of Africa and afterward of Italy by the terrible Genseric. His conquests were for the most part naval, and his triumphs were as it were a great mountain burning with fire cast into the sea. What figure would better or even so well illustrate the collision of navies and the general havoc of war on the maritime coasts? Again, just 3 brief notes on these. Third trumpet, "The third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." Again, Smith says it is here premised that this trumpet has allusion to the desolating wars and furious invasions of Attila against the Roman power, which he carried on at the head of these hordes of Huns, Attila the Hun. And again, there's a lot more detail there in Smith and Keith and Gibbon. The fourth trumpet, "The fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so that the third part of them was darkened. And the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise." A lot of third parts in here, isn't there? So you can look into that as well. But Smith again says, "We understand that this trumpet symbolizes the career of Odoacer, the barbarian monarch who was so intimately connected with the downfall of Western Rome. The symbols sun, moon, and stars, for they are undoubtedly here used as symbols, evidently denote the great luminaries of the Roman government, its emperors, senators, and consuls. But after many civil reverses and changes of political fortune, at length, at 8566, the whole form of the ancient government was subverted, and Rome itself was reduced from being the empress of the world to a poor dukedom tributary to the exarch of Ravenna." And the reason I do these briefly is I still wanted to cover them, but I wanted to get to the point where Litch actually comes in. So you have 4 so far, 4 out of 7. The other 3 are foreshadowed in this interesting language in verse 13. "And I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, 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 to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels which are yet to sound. So the following three, you have the first four, and then the following three are called the three woes. So they are not just a trumpet of a war and a calamity, but they're even worse, something even more serious. Which brings us to the fifth trumpet, which we have a whole section for here. All right, so how is the fifth trumpet introduced? Now we get to Revelation chapter 9, so we've crossed a chapter boundary. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. Very interesting, isn't it? I don't know, what's colorful language here. So now I bring in Haskell. Haskell, the one who summarizes better. The Arabs or the Saracens had never exercised any influence in the earth. In the history of nations, these free men of the desert had passed with scarcely a notice. Mohammedism united the scattered tribes and sent them forth as the conquerors of nations. So after Muhammad, the Arabs became united under one religion or one philosophy. And now, instead of, scattered wandering nomads, they became a force and a power. And we'll see this in the fifth and the sixth trumpets. Some of these things, like the earlier ones, I thought, wow, that's really interesting, but lots of details, lots of different symbols, but I was really, really interested by several things that I found here. So, verses 4 and 5, it says, "It was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given they should not kill them, but they should be tormented 5 months, and their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man." By the way, it says 5 months. Anybody have an idea what that might mean? In day for a year, 5 months. Think about that for a minute. Every month has 30 days in the Jewish calendar. So 5 months is 150 years, yeah. And you find 150 years in the history there. So, but the first verse, though, verse 4, that first of those two, it was commanded them they should not hurt the grass, anything green, or any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. Unwittingly, the secular historian Gibbon has, without realizing it, he has described exactly this. And this is I don't note it here, but I think this is Abu Bakr, when he's giving his his charge to the soldiers. He climbed up on the hill, he reviewed the army, and he told them, this is what you do. Abu Bakr, the Arab. "When you fight the battles of Allah," that's what he actually said. Now, Gibbon is quoting, and I was looking for the source, but I didn't have time to find. He would have said, "When you fight the battles of Allah, acquit yourselves like men, without turning your backs, but let not your victory be stained with the blood of women or children. Destroy no palm trees, nor burn any fields of corn. Cut down no fruit trees, nor do any mischief to cattle, only such as you kill to eat. When you make any covenant or article, stand to it, and be as good as your word." So there he is. See there? Don't destroy the green, the crops and the trees. But, what did it say? Only those who have not the seal of God. Now look at this. "As you go on, you will find some religious persons who live retired in monasteries and propose to themselves to serve God in that way. Let them alone, and neither kill them nor destroy their monasteries. And you will find another sort of people that belong to the synagogue of Satan, who have shaven crowns. Be sure you cleave their skulls and give them no quarter till they either turn Mohammedans or pay tribute." Any idea who that is? Those who have shaven crowns. Yes, that's right. there were specific orders of monks and priests who shaved their crowns, and those were the ones that Abu Bakr said, when you find them, lift their heads from their necks, cleave their skulls and give them no quarter. So Gibbon records the fulfillment very well of that prophecy. Another thing was, what strange wish did people have in those days? Verse 6, in those days shall men seek death and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. Now I scratched my head on that till Smith and Keith points me in a direction here, and so I go back actually to Gibbon to quote from what happened there. You see, you would think it's people seek death because of what was coming on them, the scourge of the Arabs coming onto the empire. However, who actually wanted to die is interesting. Do you know who wanted to die? Think about it. They're Mohammedans. Who wants to die? Gibbon says, the sword, says Muhammad. Now, Muhammad is another spelling of Muhammad, okay? The sword, says Muhammad, is the key of heaven and of hell. A drop of blood shed in the cause of God, a night spent in arms, is of more avail than 2 months of fasting or prayer. Whoever falls in battle, his sins are forgiven. At the day of judgment, his wounds shall be resplendent as vermilion and odoriferous as musk, and the loss of his limbs shall be supplied by the wings of angels and cherubim. So what is the most glorious thing to do? The most glorious thing you do is to die in battle for Allah, right? So then Gibbon says, the intrepid souls of the Arabs were fired with enthusiasm. The picture of the invisible world was strongly painted on their imagination, and the death which they always despised became an object of hope and desire, to die for Allah. So now Keith now picks it up and says, the field of battle was not only the glory but the hope of the fierce Arabian fanatics, whose natural fear of death was overcome by the lure of a sensual paradise. Remember, they get to go to paradise, you see. Such principles on such spirits, inflaming the wild Arabs, armed the woe with tenfold violence. Men in those days sought death in the faith that death could not thereby find them a moment sooner, and that the battlefield was the place by which paradise was entered. But they found it not, whose virtue lay in the slaughter of their enemies, and whose foes could not meet them in a dauntless spirit like their own. See, they believed actually in predestination, so that you were predestined to die at a certain time. That means death could not come any sooner or any later. So don't be afraid of death. Just go onto the battlefield and be courageous. And so that made them 10 times more ferocious. You see? So they went wanting to die, throwing themselves into the battle, and their enemies couldn't stand before them. It says, he goes on, they desired death in whose fancy it was enhanced with all the pleasures that they loved, but death fled from them from whom it had no terror, and against whom none could then stand on equal terms for a moment. Their spirits were on edge like the swords of Damascus, and fearless of death, and estimating their virtue by the numbers of slaughtered enemies, death fled from them. Their enemies just wouldn't stand. Like they were such an overwhelming force. They went into battle wanting to die, and they didn't die because they won. So they conquered. So I found that was very interesting, that they hoped to die, and yet death fled from them. That brings us to the sixth trumpet. Verses 13 to 15 say, the sixth angel sounded, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel which had the trumpet, loose the 4 angels which are bound in the great river Euphrates. And the 4 angels were loosed which were prepared for an hour, and a day, and a month, and a year, for to slay the third part of men. Now, students of prophecy know what river Euphrates comes from where? Source of river Euphrates? Where is it? Do we know? Okay, I said students of prophecy. I had to look it up too a few months ago when someone else was presenting. Okay, where does this? I always think Euphrates goes down through Iraq and Babylon, right? But where does it start? It's up in Turkey, yes. The headwaters of Euphrates is way back up in Turkey. So, the 4 angels are bound there. So, Josiah Litch, now we bring in Josiah Litch, because remember, this is Litch's specialty that he worked out here. So let's see what he says. The 4 angels were loosed for an hour, a day, and a month, and a year to slay the third part of men. This period amounts to 391 years and 15 days, during which the Ottoman supremacy was to exist in Constantinople. So, the Euphrates is within the territory of the Ottoman Empire. And he mentions how much the time is. Let me just pull in Smith here because Smith spells it out a little better. This period during which the Ottoman supremacy was to exist amounts to 391 years and 15 days. Thus, a prophetic year is 360 prophetic days, or 360 literal years. A prophetic month, 30 prophetic days, is 30 literal years. Okay, so we got 390 so far, right? One prophetic day is one literal year, and an hour, or the 24th part of a prophetic day, would be a 24th part of a literal day, or literal year rather, or 15 days. The whole amounting to 391 years and 15 days. Very, very specific, right? A few pages later, Smith spells it out a little more. The supremacy of the Mohammedans over the Greeks was to continue, as already noticed, 391 years and 15 days. Commencing when the 150 years ended, that was the 5 months we mentioned before. Commencing when 150 years ended, the period would end August 11, 1840. Judging from the manner of the commencement of the Ottoman supremacy, that it was by a voluntary acknowledgement on the part of the Greek emperor that he reigned only by permission of the Turkish Sultan, we should naturally conclude that the fall or departure of the Ottoman independence would be brought about in the same way. Okay, there's a lot of detail here, so follow me. We've got a few slides to get through. But there you have the starting date, July 27, 1449, the ending date, August 11, 1840, and how it started. The Ottomans became superior to the Greeks on that day. The Greek emperor, how would you say, deferred to the Turkish Sultan. So what happens at the end of it? He goes on that the end of the specified period, that is on the 11th of August 1840, the Sultan would voluntarily surrender his independence into the hands of the Christian powers, just as he had 391 years and 15 days before received it from the hands of the Christian emperor Constantine the 13th. This conclusion was reached, and this application of the prophecy was made by Elder Just J. Litch in 1838, 2 years before the predicted event was to occur. It was then purely a matter of calculation on the prophetic periods of Scripture. So Litch stuck his neck out, went out on a limb and said, this is what happened before, this is what the prophecy says, and this is what's going to happen in 1840, 2 years before. So now, here's where I have a few slides. Again, you can find this in Smith, and we'll put this in the notes as well. For several years previous to 1840, the Sultan had been embroiled in war with Mehemet Ali, Pasha of Egypt. In 1838, the trouble between the Sultan and his Egyptian vassal was for the time being restrained by the influence of the foreign ambassadors. In 1839, however, hostilities were again commenced, and were prosecuted until in a general battle between the armies of the Sultan and Mehemet, the Sultan's army was entirely cut up and destroyed, and his fleet taken by Mehemet and carried into Egypt. So completely had the Sultan's fleet been reduced that when the war again commenced in August, he had only 2 first-rates and 3 frigates as the sad remains of the once powerful Turkish fleet. This fleet Mehemet positively refused to give up and returned to the Sultan, and declared if the powers attempted to take it from him, he would burn it. In this posture affairs stood when in 1840, England, Russia, Austria, and Prussia interposed and determined on a settlement of the difficulty. For it was evident that if left alone, Mehemet would soon become master of the Sultan's throne. The Sultan accepted this intervention of the great powers, and thus made a voluntary surrender of the question into their hands. A conference of these powers was held in London, the Sheikh Effendi Bey, Likigis, being present as Ottoman plenipotentiary. An agreement was drawn up to be presented to the Pasha of Egypt, whereby the Sultan was to offer him the hereditary government of Egypt, and all that part of Syria extending from the Gulf of Suez to the Lake of Tiberias, together with the province of Acre for life. He, on his part, to evacuate all other parts of the Sultan's dominions then occupied by him, and to return the Ottoman fleet. In case he refused this offer from the Sultan, the 4 powers were to take the matter into their own hands and use such other means to bring him to terms as they should see fit. It is apparent that just as soon as this ultimatum should be put by the Sultan into the hands of Muhammad Ali, the matter would be forever beyond the control of the former, and the disposal of his affairs would from that moment be in the hands of the foreign powers. The Sultan dispatched Rifat Bey on a government steamer to Alexandria to communicate the ultimatum to the Pasha. It was put into his hands and by him taken in charge on the 11th day of August, 1840. On the same day, a note was addressed by the Sultan to the ambassadors of the four powers, inquiring what plan was to be adopted in case the Pasha should refuse to comply with the terms of the ultimatum, to which they made answer that provision had been made and there was no necessity of his alarming himself about any contingency that might arise. This day, the period of 391 years and 15 days allotted to the continuance of the Ottoman power ended. And where was the Sultan's independence? Gone. Who had the supremacy of the Ottoman Empire in their hands? The four great powers, and that empire has existed ever since only by the sufferance of these Christian powers. Thus was the prophecy fulfilled to the very letter. From the first publication of the calculation of this matter in 1838, before referred to, the time set for the fulfillment of the prophecy, August 11, 1840, was watched by thousands with intense interest. And the exact accomplishment of the event predicted, showing as it did the right application of the prophecy, gave a mighty impetus to the great Advent movement then beginning to attract the attention of the world. And I can only imagine what it must have been like in those years, especially at that time. So well documented, and that was Josiah Litch's work there, and of course that gave the great impetus to the movement he was part of. So that is a confirmation of, well, I suppose the interpretation of the seven seals, seven trumpets rather, but also of the day for a year method and the fact that it started and finished exactly in those times. So it was a contemporary example of that being fulfilled. And so no doubt God in his providence placed all of that together just for that time. So I'd like to finish with a verse from 2 Peter chapter 1, because as the Apostle Peter recounts the fact that Jesus was here, we saw him, we were with him, he then makes another comment. So look at 2 Peter chapter 1, 16 and 19. He says, "For we have not followed cunningly devised fables, when we may have made known unto you the power and coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but were eyewitnesses of his majesty." So he said, this was not just a story that was made up. We were there. We saw it. And we were eyewitnesses of everything that was done. Then he says in verse 19, "We have also a more sure word of prophecy, whereunto ye do well that ye take heed, as unto a light that shineth in a dark place, until the day dawn and the day star arise in your hearts." The alternate reading, therefore, we have also a more sure word of prophecy, is we have more sure the word of prophecy. You see, how is prophecy made more sure? How is it that we know that prophecy is confirmed, is made definite? What is it that makes prophecy more sure or definite or solid? When it's fulfilled, that's right. And so when you can look through all the prophecies in the Bible, so the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, all of those sweeps of history, and there are many of them for which we have so many fulfillments, and then we're right down the end. The very first one in Daniel, chapter 2, there's the image, and you go all the way through that sweep of prophecy, and now we're down in the toes, like the toenails of the image of the king. Do you know? And so all of these panoramas that are almost finished. And so that makes it more sure. When you can see these things happening, it makes it more sure. And there are things that are still unrolling. And we're on the cusp of events that some of them we may have talked about and others maybe we haven't talked about during this seminar, but there's so many things that they're just, I don't know if we haven't had an August 11, 1840 lately, have we? But we've had things that are happening that keep you, help us to know that we're on track. And so we have more sure the word of prophecy. And so we study prophecy because we understand that God loves us, he knows the future, he wants to show us where we are. And the God who intervened in in all the affairs of the past, cares about our life. So I'm really fascinated by this 7 trumpets, especially what transpired there in 1840. But there's actually one left, and that's the 7th one. And I'm pretty fascinated about that as well. But for tonight, we'll leave it there. And I hope that's something you have learned and your curiosity is piqued to get a little bit more into the vision of the 7 trumpets. I always found it a little bit daunting, but reading a lot of Smith and Haskell and Keith and Gibbon and finding some of those things in Gibbon about what actually transpired there has been very interesting. So nevertheless, may we find, in the midst of all of these details, find our inspiration and comfort in the Lord Jesus and the fact that he gave us all of these things for our information because he loves us and he wants us to be saved. And ultimately, he wants a relationship with us. And I hope that will be our goal. Amen.